Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. Today we're going to talk about textures. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to planar map an object. And we can find this option under the Create UVs menu, Planar Mapping. So planar mapping and UVs. First, let's talk about UVs and what UVs are. UVs are the texture or two-dimensional equivalent of X, Y, Z in 3D space. If you think of 3D space, and I'll just make a cube real quick to demonstrate. A 3D object, as I rotate my scene here, has height, width, and depth. And those three dimensions are indicated in Maya as X, Y, and Z. When you're scaling in the X axis, the Y axis, and the Z axis, you're scaling in the width, height, and depth of a 3D object. So for two-dimensional space, when you're talking about an image, like a texture, they use the UVs, where U is height and V is width. Now there are such things as 3D textures, which we're not really going to get into in this video, but in those cases they're referred to as UVWs, and W becomes the depth for the texture, like Z is the depth for an object. So when I say UVs, I'm really just talking about texture coordinates on a two-dimensional space. That'll make more sense as we go forward. So let's create a new cube. We're going to go to Create, Polygon Primitives, Cube, like so. So the idea for this project is to planar project textures onto this cube to make it look like a crate. And I've downloaded a free crate texture from the internet, so very simple. So let's say I want to do that, so I'm going to select my cube, and we've talked a little bit about materials already with kind of an introduction to materials. It might be a good idea to look at that video. I'll put a link right here on the side of the screen, and you can check out an introduction to creating materials and applying them to an object, because I don't want to go into that too in depth for this video. So if you don't know anything about that, check out that video and then come back. So I'm going to apply a new material to my cube. So I'm going to right click my cube and go to Assign New Material, and from my list of material types I'll choose Lambert and hit Control A for the attribute editor. So now I have Lambert 2 applied to my cube. So I'll select Lambert 2, and I'll rename it, and we'll call it Wood Crate. So for the color attribute for my wood crate material, I'll click the black and white checker button here, which is a mapping button. I'll click that, and that brings up the Create Render Node window. And Maya comes with lots of default textures that you could use, but I'm going to use a file texture right here. File, click that, and that lets me pick a texture that I have stored on my computer and use from external sources and not use one of Maya's provided textures. So I'll click a little window here to browse my hard drive, and I'll choose the crate texture that I have. So now my crate texture is applied to my material. So you see wood crate material sample right here. This little sample swatch or image right here shows you I have the crate material applied. And if you look at the color attribute, the color box turns black. The slider becomes grayed out because it no longer is just a color. And there's this little arrow box icon where the mapping button was, indicating that this attribute has been mapped. However, my cube is still gray. That's simply because we need to turn on texture view, and you can do that easily by pressing the 6 key on the keyboard. So there's my crate, except not, because obviously it doesn't exactly look like a good crate. If we check out my texture again, you can see that it looks more like a crate in the texture sample, but it's not really looking like that in the cube. That's because we need to map it. We need to map the UVs. So the cube comes with texture coordinates. However, they're in like a default position, and so we need to map the UVs or edit the UVs to manipulate them to fit the texture that we are applying to the object. And to do that for the cube, we're going to go to Create UVs, Planar Mapping, and I'll go into the options. And we're going to go over all these options, of course, like we always do. I'm going to go to Edit, Reset, and then hit Apply. Now I'll minimize this. So now you can see my crate texture has applied to the cube in a much more fitting way. It fits this side of the cube here. I can see the bolts and the wood slats and everything. But when I rotate my cube around, obviously it's not exactly complete yet. The texture is just smearing across the cube, and then when I get to the other side, the texture works again. So on two sides of the cube, the texture looks fine, but then within the middle of the cube, it's all smearing everywhere. And that's because we're doing a planar projection, and the word planar refers to a flat plane. And so we're planar projecting. If we look at our options again, project from the x-axis. So the x-axis is being projected in a planar direction. That's why the faces on the opposite sides of the cube along the x-axis are being projected. And if you think of like a spotlight or a projector from a movie theater, the projecting image is coming from the projector up in the projection booth onto the screen. And if that projector was suddenly rotated or turned away from the screen, that image of the film would move also, because it's coming from that projecting point. So we're projecting this texture along the x-axis, and so the tops and sides of the cube here are just having a smearing effect. So the way we fix that for this cube is to right click on the cube, and we're going to select those faces. We're going to select this face, hold down shift and select this face along the z-axis, and simply in our options we'll change the project from setting. Instead of an x-axis, we'll use the z-axis. And because we have those two faces selected, we're only going to project against those two faces instead of the entire object. So when we hit apply, you see now those two faces have been mapped, and the ones we originally mapped from the x direction are remaining the way they are because we selected those two faces to specifically map those two faces. We'll do the same for the top, hold down shift, bottom, and project from the y-axis and apply. So now it gets projected down onto the cube and only affecting those two faces and not the entire object. Because if we chose to project from the y-axis without selecting those two faces specifically and hit apply, we'll get the same effect as we had before, except now it's going from the top to the bottom and smearing down the sides. So project from, you're choosing which axis you want to project the texture in that direction, and especially with this cube and any other object that you use, you'll want to select the faces that are facing those directions and then project the UVs in that way, so that way you can get clean UVs, especially for something that's kind of boxy like this cube. You can project from the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So that's the basics of planar mapping. Now we're going to go over the other options, of course. We'll do that next. And so I will first just delete my cube. I'm just going to create really simple, a different shape. So now we're going to planar project onto this object, and you'll notice that I have this big angled surface, which that's going to make a difference, as you might imagine. So I'm going to right click and choose on my object and say assign new material, another Lambert. I'll open the attribute editor. I have Lambert 3 now, and I'll change this to brick wall. And again, I've downloaded a free brick texture off the internet, that I'll apply in the same fashion as I did before with the crate texture. I'll click the color map button, choose a file, and then apply my brick. And so here you can see how that has been applied with my current settings. Not exactly what I would want. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select our faces that are facing the axes that we're going to project from. And for this case, I'll project on the x-axis, hit apply, like so. And then I'll select these faces and project from the z-axis, these top faces, and the bottom project from the y-axis, like so. So even still though, this doesn't exactly look all that great. It still could use some work, right? I think you'd agree. So let's look at some of their other options that we have. We have keep image width and height ratio. So if I were to map these sides again and check keep image width height ratio, and we're going to map from the z-axis in this case, and hit apply. So now you can see, let me undo so you can see the original. You see the bricks are kind of all squished together. And now I hit apply with a new setting. The bricks are more spread out in the way they should be. So that kind of keeps the texture from getting squished or distorted if you keep image width height ratio. This checkbox here. And we can do that for the other sides as well. The x-axis, hit apply. But you can see that still things are a bit weird, like the bricks on the sides are bigger than the bricks on this side, and so on. So we're going to need to do something a little bit more than just simply project and just keep the default projection as it is. We have to adjust that projection in a little bit and then kind of get a different result. We'll again just project the tops and bottoms, hit apply. Now for this angled surface, projecting from the y-axis won't get us quite as accurate a result. Hit apply with the y-axis. Or we can try applying from the z-axis, since it's kind of facing the z direction a little bit, right? Hit apply. That kind of is the same thing. But what we could also do is if I adjust my camera position and kind of look at that face from that angle, I can use the camera as my project from setting. So it will look where the camera is looking and project from the camera's position and angle of rotation. So wherever I'm looking at that face, if I look over here, use my camera project from setting and hit apply, it'll project from that camera's position. If I look at it over here and hit apply this way, you can see it'll project from that angle. In this bounding box shape with all these little tabs, that's kind of an indication of the projection. It's also a 3D manipulator for the projection, which is what we're going to get into next. But you see it went away. If I hit Control A for the attribute editor, you'll see over here in my channel box I have lots of planar project history items. Each time I've done a planar projection, it's created a new history item in the channel box. And so for that latest one, Planar Project 10, up here at the top, I have that one selected right now, and all of these settings for that one planar projection. And none of these settings are actually in the options for the planar mapping options that we've been looking at. None of this stuff is in here. So this is all for the manual control of the planar projection after you've applied it. So if I click over here on the Show Manipulator button, whenever I choose one of these planar projection history items, it will display the 3D representation of that planar projection in the scene. If I click Planar Project 7, you'll see this. Click Planar Project 6, you get this. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So, oops, wrong button. So we'll have to look at and see which projection we want to manipulate. And what might be easier is actually to delete the history and start over at this point, since there's so many of them. But let's just go with Planar Project 10 first, which is projecting from the camera angle that we had onto this angled surface. I can use these handles to still manipulate that texture. You can see I can stretch it out or push it in, scale it up, move it like so. You see down here in the bottom left corner of the manipulator, there's a little red crosshatch shape. I can click this, and then I get access to my rotation. If I click my little rotate circle here, I have my rotation axis. You can see how it will adjust. It'll change the shape based on the angle of the projection. So if you want that angle to be more perfect, you can manually change that angle by rotating the projection manipulator. And so you have scale and move and everything, just like you would with any 3D object. I'll click this little crosshatch again. It'll go back to the little tabs that I can pull on and push and manipulate the object that way. But then you can, if you have certain values in mind that you want to use, over here we have rotate Y. It might be hard to see, but my camera angle that I used was not exactly 90 degrees lined up with the object. So my rotate Y right now is negative 3.4. So the texture is actually slightly angled. I can input a 0 here to straighten it up. And rotate X is negative 50.0163 or whatever. If I want this to be more of a round number, or say negative 45 degrees, just make sure you click in that box before you start typing. Negative 45. Enter. So now it's more at a 45 degree angle exactly. And my model is not at a 45 degree angle, so I could actually go in here and adjust the model after the fact. But again, this is show manipulator while you have selected one of these polyplanar projection history items from the channel box. So projection center, that's indication for this blue box in the middle. You can click it and move it manually, or you can use these values and you can middle click and drag to adjust each one manually by choosing that channel. So you can fine tune it in this way. You have image center. Let's go back to our show manipulator tool. Image center right now is 0.5 and 0.5. If I change those in show manipulator, if I move this over to say 1 and show manipulator, you'll see that what has happened is the manipulator itself has not moved, but the image has become off center. Change this to 1 also. There we go. So image center is, again, make sure you click in that box before you start typing. 0.5 and 0.5. You see the manipulator hasn't moved, but the texture itself that the manipulator is projecting is becoming offset based on this value of where the image center is on the manipulator. So the image center is 0.75. Enter. That image has been moved slightly in the projection, but not the projector itself. So it just depends on your texture and what you're looking for when it comes to image center and whether that's useful for you. Then rotate. We've already kind of looked at that a little bit with rotating 45 degrees. And you rotate Y like this, rotate Z, and so on. Show manipulator. So projection width right now is 6 point whatever. If we adjust this to say 10, you see it scales out the handle. You get the same effect by clicking and dragging on this red scale handle here. Projection height, this green handle controls that, but you can also type in whatever number you want, like 10 for example. Enter. We have image scale, U and V. So image scale right now is 1 and 1. If we hit 2 and 2, we're actually tiling the texture within the projection. So instead of the projector projecting the texture from this corner to this corner, it's actually doubling the texture. So it's doubling it twice with a image scale of 2 and 2. So it's tiling the texture within the projection. So it makes the texture more dense. So if I do 3 and 3, you can see how the bricks are getting smaller because it's tiling that texture tighter within that projection boundary. You go to 10 and 10. So now it's really tight, and you can see the tiling effect happening because this texture doesn't exactly tile that well. And then rotation angle. If we adjust this, we're rotating the texture that's being projected, not the actual projection. That's what rotate X, Y, and Z up here does. But rotation angle within the texture itself. So the texture being projected is being rotated. The projection itself hasn't moved. It's just the image that it is projecting we're rotating with rotation angle. Like so. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I think once you look at what these settings are named, you know, projection center, image center, you know, if you, the main key is to break apart in your mind what's manipulating which. You're changing the shape of the projector with this tool here, and then you can also change how the image is being affected by the projector by changing the image center. So anything that changes the image is changing the texture itself. Anything that's changing the projection is changing the projector. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So I can really quickly, I can go through here and planar map each of these things to get them looking perfect, or I can go over some more settings. If we go back to our original planar mapping options, we can look at some more settings that we haven't touched yet. Fit projection 2, we have best plane and bounding box. By default, we've been using bounding blocks this whole time. But one thing that might help with this angled surface, instead of using the camera, instead of trying to angle our camera and look at it, we can try using best plane. And you'll see project from gets all grayed out because it's going to look at the surface and try to determine what the actual best direction would be to planar map that surface. So when I hit apply, you'll see that instead of using any axis angle or the camera angle like we were doing, it's actually looking at that surface and saying this surface is angled at 49.22337, and so I'm going to project from that angle, which is actually much better than trying to line up my camera. So fit projection 2, best plane or bounding box. Project from, while bounding box is selected, you can project from the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis, or the camera. And we've already talked about keeping the image width height ratio. If this is unchecked, your texture might get squished or stretched based on the shape of the object. So then this last checkbox, which is on by default, is insert projection before deformers. So what could happen if I uncheck this, and let's say I have a deformer applied. I'm going to actually delete the history for this object, get rid of all this history stuff that we have. And now I'm going to go to animation, and you don't have to really follow along too much, just kind of watch and see. Create deformers, and then let's do a lattice. And I have a lattice video if you really want to look at lattices. I'll pause for a second, put a link here on the right, and you can go check out my lattice video going over lattice deformers. So I've applied this lattice deformer, and so I'm going to deform this shape with the lattice like this, kind of stretch it out like this. So now if I planar project, let's say I do this face again with the best plane. I do not have insert projection before deformers checked. I hit apply. So I've projected along that face. But then let's say I select my lattice again and I go to manipulate the object. You can see how my texture stays put. Like I'm shrinking the object down and changing the shape with my lattice manipulator. And you'll notice that the texture that was applied before the lattice was applied is moving along with the object. Like down here, this face right here, when I rotate these lattice points, the texture is stretching along with the object is stretching. So the object's getting stretched out and that texture is stretching along with it. But that face that I applied the texture projection to after the lattice is actually staying put. It's not actually moving. That texture is being displayed based on how wide the object is as opposed to vice versa. That's because the texture was projected after the deformer and I did not have this box checked. So let me undo those manipulations. I'll undo back before that projection. So now I have that same face selected, the same best plane projection fit option. I'll check the box for insert projection before deformers and apply. So now if I change the shape using the lattice, that texture manipulates and moves with the object the way I think it should, rather than the other way. But you may sometimes want that texture to stay put after the deformer, so it just depends on your needs for whatever project you're working on. So that's insert projection before deformers. And then last, down here at the bottom, we have UV set. You can create a new UV set. And what this simply means is we haven't really talked about UV sets as of this recording before, but a UV set, you can have, objects can have multiple UV sets applied to them. So, and by checking this box, whenever you assign a projection to the object you're set, you'll allow it to create a new UV set with that new projection applied to it. If you check that box for create new UV set, you can then name that UV set here. And we'll talk about UV sets in the future, so we're not going to really get into that too much right this second. But if I've done that video already, by the time you're watching this, hopefully I can put a link to that here. So before I go with planar projection, there's also another thing I can show you. If I go Control A for the attribute editor, you'll see that there's a polyplanar project 1 tab in the attribute editor. And it still has all those settings from the channel blocks in here as well. You have projection center, there's rotate, projection width and height, and they come with sliders, so it might be a little bit easier to manipulate for you. So keep that in mind. You don't necessarily have to use the channel box input right here. You can use the attribute editor and get some handy sliders and such. Alright, well this has been the Maya tool belt for planar projecting textures onto polygons. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like, comment, subscribe. If I did miss something, let me know. I appreciate it. And thanks for watching.